Welcome to the podcast where we dive into the pages of popular books in the life sciences with the writers who made them happen, from new releases to timeless classics. I'm your host, Hedi Young, and today we have the second part of my chat with writer Moheb Costandi, the author of the wonderful book, Body, Am I? The New Science of Self-Consciousness. Welcome, Mo.
Hello, thanks for having me.
Now, this book is all about how our brain perceives the body and how it creates our conscious experience of it. And in the first episode, we talked about the first core component of bodily awareness, body ownership. And we explored the mysteries of phantom limbs, the rubber hand illusion, and body integrity identity disorder, in which people feel the need to remove a limb in order to feel whole again. And in this episode, we'll be discussing the concept of agency, the second core component of bodily awareness outlined in Mo's book, and we'll show how our sense of agency can even be manipulated at the operating table. And we'll discuss conditions like anorexia nervosa and Alice in Wonderland Syndrome, as well as the fascinating notion of peripersonal space. Finally, we'll also consider the broader implications these topics have on our understanding of consciousness. So let's pick up where we left off. We talked about bodily awareness and how it's composed of two components. The first we've discussed bodily ownership, and the second is agency.
Agency is the sense that we are in control of our bodies and are responsible for the consequences of our actions. So let's say when I flick a light switch, I sense the switch on my fingers, I hear it click, and then a fraction of a second later the light comes on. So I know that I performed an action. The consequences of that action were down to me. This process of agency, it can break down in various conditions. So one probably very well known example, because it's so bizarre, is the alien hand syndrome, which can occur in rare cases as a result of a stroke that damages certain parts of the brain. And this is where the patient reports that their limb has a mind of its own and they are not in control of its actions. They don't deny that the limb belongs to them, they just deny that they are in control. This was portrayed in the film Dr. Strangelove, where Peter Sellers' character does a Nazi salute. But agency can also break down in less obvious ways. In schizophrenia, for example, schizophrenia often involves visual or auditory hallucinations where the patient cannot distinguish between sensory events arising from the outside world and sensory experiences that are generated internally. So, of course, a hallucination is internally generated purely by spontaneous brain activity in the absence of any external stimulus. But the patient misattributes the origins of those perceptions or sensations and mistakenly attributes them to external rather than internal events. So that also involves a breakdown in the sense of agency.
And as you say, schizophrenia is an interesting one, actually, because yes, the patients often describe the feeling that that their actions, thoughts, and speech are being controlled by some external force rather than by themselves. They'll say things like, my fingers pick up the pen, but I don't control it. That the force moved my lips. I began to speak. The words were made for me. But at the same time, there are also disruptions in the body image, body ownership disruptions. The boundaries of the self become loose or blurred, such that the patient may feel that the parts of his body do not belong to them, and that they are part of plants or other people even.
Yeah, so there does appear to be a more general breakdown in mechanisms of bodily awareness, not just agency, but body ownership as well. But we still have very little understanding of what's happening, especially with regards to schizophrenia.
Yeah, no, it seems to be possibly describing a range of different conditions that may be related to each other. But it's interesting in that it does seem to touch on disruptions both in agency and in body ownership. You describe, for example, a 39-year-old crane operator who began to hear voices alleging that he had crab hands, and also that the feeling in his hands was that they were shrinking and becoming hard like crab's claws. So it does seem to play on both these senses of bodily awareness. And actually, interestingly, since we're talking about schizophrenia, we talked about how people with phantom limb will use a mirror box to try and alleviate the pain they may feel of having a phantom limb by looking into the mirror and feeling as though the missing limb is there. It somehow subdues the pain. And I was just reading a Guardian article on avatar therapy, which is where patients with schizophrenia will listen to impersonations of the voices they hear in their head. And clinicians will help patients confront these voices by creating and interacting with digital avatars that represent these voices. And it does seem, at least in a couple of patients mentioned in the article that kind of struggle with these auditory hallucinations, that there are remarkable improvements.
It's possible that these interactions could help the patient to, or make them less likely, should I say, to misattribute the voices they hear.
Yeah. And going back to the alien limb syndrome, what's interesting is that the behaviors of the alien hand are often the very opposite of what the patient wants to happen. And I think this is described as self-oppositional behavior, where the hand basically counteracts the intended actions of the other. You describe a 45-year-old male patient who had a stroke, and then who complained of involuntary masturbation, that his right hand used to grab his genitals involuntarily, even in public places.
Yeah, it's quite remarkable. Could imagine people trying to use this as a legal defense for all manner of things, but I'm not sure they could get away with it unless there was some strong neurological evidence that they actually do suffer from alien hand syndrome.
Right. It wasn't me that did it. It was my alien hand.
Exactly.
Well, actually, they may not be able to use that as a defense in court, but they may have more luck in refuting the concept of free will, which comes under scrutiny in your book, where you can actually see free will being manipulated.
So the sense of agency can be manipulated experimentally by altering the time between when an action is performed and when its sensory consequences occur. So if we go back to my example of flicking a light switch, if I flick a light switch and then the light comes on 6 seconds after I've flicked the switch, I'll probably start to doubt whether my action was actually responsible for the light coming on. So there's a set of experiments performed here in London at UCL, which manipulated the interval between an action being performed and its consequences. What they found was when they extended the interval, the participants reported feeling less of a sense of agency over their actions. One of the conclusions from these experiments is that the brain actually distorts our perception of time in order to to enhance our sense of agency. When we perform an action and when its consequences occur, there's a gap. And these researchers concluded that the brain actually distorts our perception of time to bring those two events closer together to enhance our sense of agency. So the closer our actions are to their consequences, the more agency we feel. And so they called this process intentional binding.
And you give a couple of striking examples of how surgeons manipulate agency at the operating table, which give us clues as to what may be going on in our brain when we perform what we think is a voluntary action. In 1991, surgeons found that electrically stimulating specific brain areas known as the supplementary motor area and the pre-supplementary motor area caused people to feel an urge to move. And with higher intensity, it even triggered actual movements in those body parts. And later, a team showed that stimulating the parietal region of the brain made patients feel a strong desire to move their opposite limb. And when the intensity was increased, patients were convinced they had actually moved, even though they had not. And this suggests that the supplementary motor area may be key to starting movements, while the parietal cortex mainly shapes our sense of intention to move. Just a couple of amazing examples of how something very personal to us, our sense of agency, the feeling that we are in control of our actions, can be so easily manipulated at the operating table. So another condition that you mention in your book is anorexia nervosa, which I think may be more familiar to our listeners than some of the other conditions we've discussed. Could you just talk to us a bit about this condition, which also involves distorted body representations?
Or at least distorted body awareness. So anorexia nervosa is an eating disorder. It's probably one of the most common conditions that I describe in the book. And there's pretty good evidence that it's characterized by disturbances of bodily awareness, how we perceive our bodies from the outside, and also disturbances in interoception, disturbances in the ability to read the internal bodily signals, especially those arising from the gut, internal signals related to hunger and satiety. So patients with anorexia will typically have the mistaken belief that they are overweight or obese and will alter their eating behavior accordingly.
Right. And like many of the conditions we've discussed, there's nothing new about it. This was first described in 1689 by the English physician Richard Morton, and you talk about him in the book. And after examining an extremely emaciated 18-year-old female patient, described her as a skeleton only clad in skin. And because the wasting of the body was attended with a want of appetite, Morton called the condition nervous consumption. And then the term anorexia nervosa was coined almost 2 centuries later. And several brain scanning studies have been conducted among people with anorexia.
Yeah, so there is evidence that visual processing is altered. Structure of the visual cortex also altered in patients with anorexia, which could contribute to the way they perceive their bodies. But there's also studies which suggest that the unconscious aspects of bodily awareness are also altered.
Yes, I mean, you mentioned one behavioral study where people with anorexia, when walking through narrow door like openings, will start turning far earlier than they actually need to, suggesting that they have a kind of unconscious, distorted representation of their body size.
Yeah, yeah. Well, obviously, the book's full of experiments and illusions which show how easy it is to manipulate how we perceive our bodies. You can manipulate things like the sounds your body makes to alter how we perceive our bodies. So even simply just wearing a set of headphones that play lighter or heavier footfalls as you're walking along is enough to make a person feel that their body is lighter or heavier than it actually is. And so that opens up new avenues for treating something like anorexia.
And this leads us onto another condition in your book, which involves distortions in body size, and that is Alice in Wonderland Syndrome, where migraines cause dramatic distortions in body perception, including sensations of body parts feeling unusually large or small.
Yeah, so migraine and epilepsy are the two most common causes. And as you said, it involves quite severe distortions of how a person perceives their body. So they may feel their neck to be extremely long, or their arms to be very long, or their hands to be disproportionately large. And this was named Alice in Wonderland syndrome after a neurologist suggested that the descriptions his patients had given him of these essentially hallucinations were very similar to those that Lewis Carroll described in his book, Alice's Adventures in Wonderland. Some neurologists now believe that Carroll probably experienced these hallucinations, these distortions of body perception himself, because he described them so vividly.
It should be said that this is a very rare condition, I think, with fewer than 200 cases reported in the literature. And you describe a fascinating case of a 23-year-old secretary who describes her hallucinations as follows. About every 6 months, I would have a major attack that lasted for weeks and required hospitalization. It was at these times that I experienced the sensation that my head has grown to tremendous proportions and was so light that it floated up to the ceiling, although I was sure it was still attached to my neck. This sensation would pass with the migraine, but would leave me with a feeling that I was very tall. When walking down the street, I would think I would be able to look down on the tops of others' heads, and it was very frightening and annoying not to see as I was feeling. The sensation was so real that when I would see myself in a window or full length mirror, it was quite a shock to realize that I was still my normal height of under 5 feet. A pretty vivid illustration of the kinds of hallucinations that this syndrome can give you.
It's probably much more common than the medical literature would suggest. These cases that have been described are more extreme cases where the symptoms are longer lasting, but I suspect that many people will experience all kinds of body perception distortions throughout their lives, but not ones that are significant enough for them to go to see a doctor.
Right. Now, another thing that I found very interesting is that you talk about how our bodily awareness can actually extend beyond the physical boundaries of our body to the space immediately surrounding it, what's called our peripersonal space, within which we can grasp and reach objects.
Yeah. So the peripersonal space refers to the space immediately surrounding our bodies, and there's a lot of evidence to suggest that the brain actually treats this space around our bodies as part of the body itself. So you can think of the peripersonal space as a sort of bubble surrounding your body.
You mentioned studies that have found in monkeys certain brain cells in the premotor cortex respond to the peripersonal space.
Yeah, so there are multi-sensory cells that respond to vision and touch and so on. Experiments in monkeys show that these cells can be activated not just by stimuli on the body itself, but stimuli that extend just beyond the boundaries of the body. And there are quite a lot of experiments showing that peripersonal space is very important for things like tool use, for example. So learning to use a tool, the tool basically becomes an extension of one's body. So the brain is extending the boundaries of the body to incorporate the tool into its representation of the body. And all of this is happening within the peripersonal space, within this bubble that envelops the body.
Yeah, you mentioned one study in 1996 in which Japanese researchers trained macaque monkeys to pull distant objects towards them with a rake while recording the activity of neurons in the somatosensory cortex. And they found large numbers of what are called bimodal cells that responded to both touch and visual stimuli. And as the monkeys used the rake, their visual receptive fields, the size of the visual field to which the cells respond to, increased dramatically in size, responding to food not just when it was close to their hand, but also when it appeared along the entire length of the rake and in any position accessible with it. Remarkable example of how malleable the brain is. A recurring theme, it seems, in our chat.
Yeah. So Henry Head, who you mentioned at the beginning of our last talk, he was working in the early 20th century, and he was interested in body posture and how damage to certain parts of the brain disrupts posture, disrupts perception of the body, and he developed the term the body schema, which he defined as a postural model of the body. And Head argued that the body schema extends to the tip of the feather in a Victorian lady's hat. And here I think he was alluding to this much later idea of the peripersonal space. And so the clothes we wear, our accessories, tools that we use, or any objects that we hold and use are incorporated into the brain's representation of the body.
Yes, even touching a stick that someone is holding in their hand will activate the part of the brain that responds to touch of the hand itself. And I guess this is also relevant for prosthetics.
Yeah. An artificial limb can be incorporated into the body, and if it can provide some sort of sensory feedback, then this process of integrating it into the body is more complete. Well, sensory feedback from an artificial limb enhances a sense of ownership over the prosthesis, and also a sense of agency, allows the user to control it better as well.
You mentioned a couple of studies from researchers, again in Japan, that made participants feel as if a humanoid robot's body was their own. They wore motion capture gear that linked their hand movements to the robot's hands. And when they saw the robot moving exactly as they intended, it created the strong illusion that they were actually inside the robot's body. Again, showing how powerful visual feedback can be. Simply seeing the robot respond to their intentions was enough to make them feel a sense of ownership over it. So we've mentioned a lot of different conditions in which our sense of body ownership and our sense of agency can be disturbed. And so what then are the implications for our understanding of consciousness?
Bodily awareness is crucial to self-consciousness. Until quite recently, it was an aspect of consciousness that most researchers ignored. But 30 years ago, when brain imaging technologies, fMRI and so on, were first developed, researchers who are interested in consciousness focused on how we perceive the outside world, what happens in the brain when a visual stimulus enters conscious awareness, and which is an important thing to understand, but that completely ignores half of the problem, which is self-consciousness. Consciousness is not just being aware of the outside world, it's being aware of oneself in relation to the outside world. And research into bodily awareness is really beginning to give us lots of useful information about how self-consciousness arises. I think research into bodily awareness can tell us something about consciousness in other animals as well.
All right. Well, I think that about wraps it up, Mo. In the show notes, we'll include links to organizations that might be helpful for those dealing with some of the conditions we've discussed, from phantom limbs to anorexia. These include the Pain Relief Foundation, the Limbless Association, Blesma, and Beat. How can our listeners get in touch with you, Mo, and find out more about your work?
Or they can go to my website, neurophilosophy.wordpress.com. That has contact details and links to a lot of my work.
Super. And is there a book, fiction or non-fiction, that you would like to recommend to our listeners?
I'd recommend my new favourite book, The Book of Disquiet by Fernando Pessoa, who lived in Lisbon, actually. It's hard to describe. I'm not sure if it's entirely fiction or non-fiction, but it is a remarkable examination of self-awareness, mostly emotions and perceptions and so on.
Well, our Portuguese listeners will no doubt be very happy to hear that. Fantastic. Well, this has been a wonderful journey that you've taken us on, Mo, and I hope our listeners have a sense of just how weird the human mind can be. So once again, thank you so much for taking the time to chat with us about it.
Thank you very much for inviting me on.